Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show of the Western Standard. It is Thursday, January the 29th. Just over a week ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a widely acclaimed keynote speech at Davos, Switzerland, to the World Economic Forum, and he declared the old world order dead and committed Canada to be leading a new one. Technically, as a speechwriter from the old days for a Canadian Prime Minister, I must say that his remarks were well prepared and delivered. But is his analysis correct? And is the strategy that he's proposing for Canada capable of restoring the country's status in the world? Joining us now is David Knight-Legg, a strategic advisor to the Alberta government, energy and financial services firms. And he is no stranger to the Western Standard. Good to have you back, David.
Great to be here. Great to see you again, Nigel.
And likewise, David, like everybody else who listened to Mr. Carney's speech at Davos, I was impressed with the remarks as a piece of prose. Aristotle applauds from the grave, and perhaps Thucydides too. And yet I had that feeling there's something off here that I'm missing. I'm being conned. And as I thought about it, it occurred to me that Mr. Carney is lamenting something, that is, the international rules-based order, that never really was. He even says so in a kind of way later. So when he remarks that we knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, so his basic takeaway was that Trump, who he didn't actually name, had ended this apocryphal international rules-based order, and the new reality was a multipolar world in which the big powers did what they wanted. To me, that sounds very much like the world before the Second World War. So first question, isn't Mr. Carney's multipolar world actually just business as usual?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. I think the appeal of his speech took two or three different vectors. And I think, it was appealing. The thing that surprised me about this speech is it was a speech that would be given by a well-informed spectator. It was a speech of a political science professor, a law professor. In an odd way, it wasn't a speech that struck me as being given by a world leader. And in some ways, I think people find that refreshing. It was long on description. You've noted it quoted Aristotle, Thucydides, hero of mine, Václav Havel. I think deeply misquoted Václav Havel. But as a piece of art, it was compelling because it described very effectively the state of the world to some extent. I think what is odd for a world leader like Mark Carney is that it did not draw any clear prescriptions, courses of action, and to the extent that it would have, his actual actions over the last 9 months have been completely contrary to the theory of the speech. And that's what's deeply problematic about it. The speech is excellent, but it's almost like listening to somebody that's a good cover band. You can recognize the song, you like it, but it's not the person who wrote it. It's not what was intended by the person who wrote it. And it's being delivered by somebody who in many ways represents, to my mind, the opposite of Václav Havel. Mark Carney wrote an op-ed in the middle of the Freedom Convoy calling Canadian citizens seditious. That was carefully chosen language by somebody that knows better. It was followed through on as a matter of sedition. And that his theory of the case, which he wrote in the op-ed, was then shown to be deeply problematic for civil rights, for freedom, totally totalitarian in every way, the exact opposite of what someone like Václav Havel would have thought was appropriate for people that were obviously political dissenters of mandates that ended up being very quickly thrown out for being unscientific. These were the people, these were the shopkeepers that had tossed the sign out of the window, decided to stand up against totalitarian overreach in their country. And the first person to oppose them and demand that the politically correct totalitarian framing of COVID be enforced by a police state was Mark Carney, who just gave a speech quoting Václav Havel.
So I'd like to come back. I'd like to come back to Václav Havel in a minute, but for those people who actually did listen to this speech, Mr. Carney did appear to offer a path forward, a path between what he would say submission and isolation. And it all sounds good, but it was supposed to be a coalition of middle power countries coming together to do what they could, given the polarity of China, the United States, and Russia. But this kind of middle power alliance sounds a bit like the deer forming a coalition against the wolves. What, is that what you're getting at when you say that it's a bit delusional?
Yeah, look, I think Canada has the greatest opportunity economically in the planet because we're only, 45, 50 million people. We have 77 to 80% of our trade depends entirely on the United States. The next largest trade bloc we have is about 10%, which is all of the EU and the UK together. And after that, China is around 4%. And then you've got, single digit percentages around the world. So far, since Mark Carney was elected, we've had virtually no serious progress on the most important trading relationship that we have. So you can give a speech citing Thucydides, and this is what you'd expect of a law professor, political science professor, is an excellent speech for somebody who's a spectator. It was a terrible speech for somebody who's got to renegotiate Kuzma in the summer. It was a terrible speech in multiple levels. First of all, it was the wrong speech to give because it drew a false moral equivalence between great powers, as if China and the United States are the same sort of problem because they're hegemons. That's deeply reckless for anybody to say out loud. It's especially reckless for the leader of Canada. We have a series of actions that are being taken by his government that are deeply counterproductive right now in the relationship that we have with the United States. They're counterproductive on the three things that matter most: energy, national security, and economic security and trade. So again, a speech is very important, but the person who gives the speech is as important as the speech when the purpose of the speech is to outline or compel action. And what had happened with this speech is the speech had followed very quickly after a series of concessions were made to the world's most totalitarian state, China, in a juxtaposition with the relationship with the United States, very intentionally drawn by the prime minister, and recklessly so. So I think that the problem with the speech is not the quality of the speech. The delivery of the speech was exceptional. Aspects of the speech were very, very appealing in that it described the current moment in the way that a great political science professor would describe it. But for Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, to have given that speech in light of the deep confusion around his interpretation of what the shopkeeper with the sign in the window in Václav Havel's book, Power of the Powerless, was intended to address, Mark Carney himself represented in his op-ed against the Freedom Convoy complete totalitarianism in the name of natural political dissent. In the current moment, that Václav Havel comment is all about the political correctness that is dominant in a place like Davos and has been dominant in the rhetoric and the positioning that Mark Carney has had on green issues and finance and things like defense. So it's very awkward for someone like Mark Carney to be the one giving a Václav Havel quote. The Thucydides quote on strength is fascinating, but Thucydides, but he seemed to draw an unusual parallel. Thucydides' arguments on strength weren't Nietzschean. Thucydides' arguments on strength were descriptive, and they were descriptive in a way that was compelling courage in the face of challenges. And what I've seen in the Carney government is so far, and I'm hoping that this will change, especially in the next few weeks, and I hope quickly, there has to be a new level of honesty in this government on the cause of our economic decline and our problem with trade. The rapid rise in the decline of Canadian cities and the rapid rise in violent crimes across Canada, the rapid rise in physician-assisted suicides, the 50,000 kids that have died out of fentanyl and opioid overdoses in the last decade of this, complete nihilism with respect to drugs and the drug trade. the rapid growth of criminal and terror syndicates across the country, Donald Trump is not to be blamed for any of this. This has happened under a government that's adopted deeply progressive, flawed ideas about what to do in the face of crime. They've created more debt in, I think it's the first 7 years of their government than all other governments put together. And Mark Carney's just delivered the worst, peacetime deficit or the worst non-emergency deficit in the history of the country. So you've got extraordinary debt. You've got the worst performing GDP per capita performance in all 40 OECD nations, the worst performance in GDP growth in the G7 for the last 10 years. You've got extraordinary problems with crime. You've got the worst results in the public service, in spite of the fact that in the last 10 years, they've bloated the public service more than 45% and made it 75% more expensive. There's almost no metric right now that you can point to that you could say the problem that Canada faces is Donald Trump. Almost every single one of these metrics that are affecting our quality of life, our national security, the ability of people to feel safe walking in our cities, the rise in anti-Semitic crime. It goes on and on and on. This has to do with a series of failed policy ideas and failed presumptive ideological ideas that Mark Carney has been in the forefront of in his party and that his party is responsible for. And what they discovered when they ran the last election is that people, especially the older demographics that depend on mainstream media that is funded by the government, will see their lives and see their opportunities through the lens of the framing that the government's given. And what was convenient was to say, there's the scary person running the United States and we're going to stand up to him. And I think there's a certain amount of sort of political realpolitik and strategic nous in the way that they ran that election. But I also think that that's bordered very quickly on complete cynicism. And the fundamental problem with Mark Carney's speech is not that it wasn't an excellent speech or that it was descriptively accurate of the moment we live in. It's that the person giving it doesn't represent remotely the ideals behind what Václav Havel was speaking about. And as a result, it struck me very much like the elbows up thing, tactically effective, but deeply cynical.
So what is the game? Is he a true ideologue? There are things that he has been associated with that would make you think that he was a green prime minister and that was all that mattered. We have to save the planet, when there are so many arguments that if the planet has to be saved, it isn't going to be Canada doing it. Is he just he want electric cars from China so that we can have lower emissions? Or is there something more deeply cynical? Is he trying to make Canada a different kind of, intentionally trying to make Canada a different kind of place?
Look, no, I don't want to believe that of anybody that gives a lot of their time and energy and effort to public service. I think that at the end of the day, they must want to create a better world for our kids to inherit, right? I mean, I think that's the point, and that's the purpose of most people that engage. I think that what happens is the first order sort of instincts of anyone in politics is to win elections, hold the power so that you can then exercise it in the manner in which you think can secure the future for our kids and create a better society. I think one of the things that I was hopeful about with Prime Minister Carney is that when he ran for the election, coming from outside the country as he did, I was actually hopeful that that was a strength and that he would see that certain things about his party's ideological positioning, particularly with respect to energy and energy security, had gone way beyond any sort of rational rapprochement between the environment, energy, and economy, and it had become completely dogmatic in ways that were just ridiculous. The C-48, C-69 represents that. But he got rid of the carbon tax, he got rid of the capital gains tax, some of the things that were deeply harming the economy. And so my hope was, and it still is, obviously, because he is the prime minister, he has great people around him that are giving him good advice, that the mistake that he made by calling the Freedom Convoy seditious, the enormous mistakes they've made by maintaining C-69 and C-48, which are just poking the the bear in Alberta in terms of the new run for independence. These are things that I am hoping that he will see his way through to something that's far more centrist and far more representative of where most Canadians are at. I thought the speech was excellent. Most of my friends have sent me notes saying, "We really liked your speech. Congratulations. You've got a great prime minister." So it's hard for me to say. I think the speech was morally confused, and that it's like a cover band covering a song that I like. I love hearing anybody give Václav Havel's "Power of the Powerless" airtime, and I think there's something deeply moving about his language, and I think there's a lot about his language that's pertinent to the current moment, especially if you think about these unbelievable places like Iran and Russia and China under socialist Marxist or Islamo-Marxist totalitarian regimes. You hope that there's more Václav Havel and Thucydides and some of those comments going on. But what I hope in the case of Mark Carney is that he looks at the opportunity right now to change Canada, to upgrade Canada's current political approach and policy approaches to a freer economy where we can go back to being one of the most prosperous nations instead of the least prosperous.
Well, but that takes us back to the very public choice that he made to go and embrace China. I mean, this is, with his earlier experience through Brookfield with China, no doubt he knows his ways around the corridors where the decisions are made. But I find, just speaking for myself here, the idea of dumping the United States, even if you don't like Mr. Trump, who won't be there in 3 years' time, to embrace a nation with the ideals and practices of the People's Republic of China, I find that quite abhorrent. We have a bad history with China. That makes me suspicious of what Mr. Carney's goals really are. And you're making the case that we should give him a chance, I think, and I think we've given him a year. Why are you not as cynical as I am, David?
Well, look, I think there's... I don't think you're cynical, Nigel, first of all. I think that...
A lot of people do. But...
Well, I think you're hopeful, and I think one of the things that you're very good at is pointing out what you think is not working, and I think that's the appropriate role of a good journalist, is to sort of find whatever you think the gaps are between what's being said and what's actually being done. And I think that's the biggest challenge for the Carney administration in Canada right now. I think that Canada needs to do business with China. China's a very important trading partner, but it's only 4% of our export GDP. The United States is 77%. The issue is not whether or not Mark Carney has a conversation with China about, their tariffs on canola. That was a conversation that needed to happen. The issue is the craven way in which Canada seems to naively bend the knee to China so easily and so often and in so many ways. The open border with respect to Chinese trads in the port of Vancouver and the fentanyl trade is disgusting. And it's something that has been allowed to metastasize. It's one of the worst cancers in Canadian society, and yet it's somehow swept under the rug and not talked about very openly. We have 50,000 kids that are dead because of the fentanyl and opioid crisis in this country. And when this was raised by the Americans as part of their concern on the border, it was poo-pooed by our media. It was treated as a pretext. And instead of us just acknowledging we have a huge crisis, and it's a moral crisis. So 50,000 young lives are gone in this country. Where do you read about this? I find it absolutely extraordinary that we have death at that scale with a known supply chain that we seem completely incapable of actually changing our laws to deal with. It's well known across Vancouver that the Mexican cartels and the Chinese trads are in bed with each other. The Chinese look after laundering and they look after the port, and the cartels do whatever they want. The embarrassment to me of this issue being raised and having our leadership scoff at the idea that we were potentially a fentanyl problem when they knew it was all the southern border. And yet the amount of fentanyl that they said that we had found crossing the border was less than the amount sitting on one shelf in one super lab that gets busted with the help of the FBI 6 months later. I mean, it's extraordinarily embarrassing when you look at the crisis the different pillars of crisis, the relationship between China and the United States. I was stunned when Meng Wanzhou was taken by Canada and put under house arrest at one of her 3 mansions in Vancouver, and they illegally took hostage 2 of our diplomats. The fact that their ambassador wasn't sent packing the next day was extraordinary to me. The Chinese see Canada as incredibly weak and pliable, and I don't know why. And I know there's a lot of good work done. There's an incredible young journalist, Sam Cooper, who does exceptional work on the Canada's overall security issues. But he is very
we know Sam. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's others that have done that too. But I think he's exceptional. And so I think that for Canada to do any kind of business with China, we've got to not be seen as weak and naive. And unfortunately, I think we are seen that way. And I think we're seen that way with respect to their secret police stations. We're seen that way with respect to the way that they have been able to override any kind of common sense on some of the people that are put up for parliament. CSIS has talked about this. So that's in the background. I understand why you would say you're cynical. I think that as a nation, we've got to be able to do deals with all countries. I'm a free trade maximalist. I think Canada should be working very hard at creating global market infrastructure. I think that, for instance, when the U.S. took over Venezuela, and I wrote an op-ed on this defending it as illegal, that what they did was legal when they renditioned Maduro. China lost around 550,000 barrels a day from that incident from Venezuelan heavy crude. Alberta can actually provide all of that if we reinstate the Northern Gateway. We could provide all of that back to China. It would be a $16 billion a year trade for us. It would give us additional leverage in China. It would give us 15% more of our output going in the direction of another superpower other than the United States. It would give us diplomatic leverage in China that actually matters to the Chinese. And it would have been something that I would have loved to have seen come out of the China conversation. So I don't want to be hypocritical in saying there are things that I would love to see us do deals with China on. I think the Americans would have expected us to do that. The President Trump was asked about this and said, I'm glad they're doing deals with China. People are realists, and Canada needs to be realistic. But I didn't see us do a massive energy deal with China. I saw us allow EVs into our country. The problem with EVs, by the way, for those who think that the Americans are simply trying to be economic bullies, EVs are like iPhones on wheels. They are extraordinary data collection machines. All of the BYD EVs have been kicked out of one country in particular because of the security risks in the metadata that gets transferred back to China. There's a lot that I think Canada has just been on a vacation from history and is therefore naive about China. And the reason for that is because we're completely protected by the United States from the geopolitical realities that they take on. And so I would
mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I would love to see us just understand what the Americans have told us several times, which is they're integrating energy security with military, national security, with trade security. And Canada continues to make a series of steps that I think are just naive to the point of reckless with respect to all three. And so we've got to finish our F-35 purchase instead of holding it up for yet another, after 20 years, internal, navel gazing around what we're going to do on this. I think we have to expand NORAD to include naval security in AUKUS. I think we have to integrate what we're doing in the Arctic with what the Americans are going to be doing with Greenland. I think we have to get on with a proper trade negotiation that acknowledges some of the risks that the Americans want us to address. And I think we have to get rid of this decade-long experiment with green alarmism and get on with just building Canada's global energy infrastructure. And if we don't, we're going to start to see the country fragment.
Well, I think that's what a lot of people are speculating about right now, and for all the reasons you've given. We're almost out of time. Let me just ask you this. I believe you're traveling, you're on a business trip to the Middle East. Where are you today?
The Middle East right now. I'm in Abu Dhabi right now.
Yeah. How are you finding it?
That's incredible. It's, the Emirates were a dream back in the 50s, and they made it into an extraordinary reality. There are several countries in the UAE. Dubai is very well known. Abu Dhabi is the largest and the energy rich nation. Alberta could easily be the wealthiest nation in the world, actually, with 5 million people and more oil than Russia, China, and the United States put together, and as much gas as Qatar. And this is what I think Prime Minister Carney has got to be very careful about right now. You can't continue to tie the hands of one of the world's largest energy superpowers, Alberta, behind their back out of some dated idea of what Eastern-based federalism looks like much longer before you're going to start to just create strains that will crack. And
First thing we should do is build something in Calgary that's taller than the Brookfield building. That's what we say.
Well, the Burj Khalifa here is, Dubai built the Burj Khalifa actually as a tribute to the gentleman from Abu Dhabi who built the Emirates. And, it's extraordinary to see what that level of vision can create. And that's what I hope for Canada. It's what I hope for Alberta. And I think that Mark Carney has a lot of potential. I was one of the very few. I liked the speech, the way that I like a song, but I thought that it was being played by a cover band, not somebody that can speak for Václav Havel after writing about sedition when it came to Canadian dissent on COVID.
David, we'll leave it there, and thank you for that. When you get back, if you want finding a 57 Buick so you don't give all your personal information to the Chinese, you'll join the queue. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, David. For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.